Our speaker is Nicco Mele. He's an entrepreneur, Harvard faculty member, and a consultant to Fortune 1,000 companies. He graduated from William and Mary College with a bachelor's degree in government, then worked for several high-profile advocacy organizations where he pioneered the use of social media for fundraising. He was webmaster for Howard Dean's 2004 presidential bid, where he and the campaign team popularized the use of technology and social media that revolutionized political fundraising and reshaped American politics. And many people here remember exactly what that was. Following that experience, he co-founded a company called Echo Ditto, which now recently merged with Teal Media to become Echo & Company. And it's a leader in internet strategy and consulting. And their nonprofit and corporate clients have included Barack Obama's, another familiar name, successful Senate campaign, the Clinton Global Initiative, Sierra Club, UN World Food Program, St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, Google, and AARP. Nicco is also on the faculty at Harvard Kennedy School, where he teaches graduate-level classes on the internet and politics. He serves on a number of private and nonprofit boards, including the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard and Breakthrough.tv. Nicco is also co-founder of the Massachusetts Poetry Festival. His first book, it's good, first book, right? The End of Big was published last year, and he'll be talking about ideas from that book, where he talks about not only the radical changes brought about by the technology revolution and the internet and some of the bad things that could happen, but goes past that to what I think is critical for City Club members. What does that do or pose in terms of threats to our current values, and how do we restructure current institutions to meet those challenges and still keep the values in times to come? So without any more, I'd like to introduce Nicco Mele. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be at any event sponsored by an organization called Totally Chocolate. I'll do that anytime. I have, my grandparents moved to Bellingham almost 30 years ago. My parents almost 15 years ago. I have had many, many summers here in Bellingham and love it dearly. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. I'm going to start by talking about a moment I think the world changed in 1984. Many of you, if you're a good nerd, you'll remember that 1984 was the year that Steve Jobs introduced the first Macintosh personal computer. But that's actually not what I'm talking about. In 1984, a guy named Chuck Hull invented something called stereolithography. Today, we call stereolithography 3D printing. I have a 3D printer. I put a spool of plastic thread into it. I download off the internet the blueprints for something, and then it melts the plastic thread and sprays it into the shape of whatever I've downloaded. I bought my 3D printer at Staples for $1,000. I have two little boys who are 5 and 3. And they are right now running around Boulevard Park causing trouble. The rain did not deter them even in the slightest. And I live in Boston, and we have these cold winters, and the boys are bouncing off the walls. So we have our first warm spring day, and I want the boys to be able to run around outside in sandals. But I don't want to put them in the car and drive to the mall and buy sandals. That'll take a day. That'll take all day. And so the night before, I downloaded the blueprints for sandals and printed on my 3D printer sandals for my boys. Which sounds fantastic, right? I mean, awesome. It's entirely possible my boys will never go to a shoe store. They might not even ever buy shoes online. When they need shoes, they might just go file menu print. My wife is pretty excited about the idea of melting them down and reprinting them every time their feet grow. But about 3 days after I printed the shoes for my boys, a guy in Texas put up the blueprints to print all of the regulated pieces of an AR-15 assault rifle like the one used in Sandy Hook. And then all the regulated pieces of an AK-47, and then finally, all of the blueprints to print a fully functional handgun. Just go to the hardware store and buy deck screws. I think this story kind of perfectly encapsulates the opportunity, the excitement of our technology. Printing shoes. There's a guy running around trying to use 3D printers to print eyeglasses in refugee camps. Right? There's all kinds of incredible opportunities opened up by our technology. But there are also some very serious perils. And in many ways, our institutions are unprepared for what's coming. Our technology has outstripped the pace of our institutions. And I think the case that I want to make to you today, and the case that I make in my book, is that our technology pushes power out of institutions to individuals. That the power comes out of the big traditional established institutions to you, to your person, in a way that is exciting and full of opportunity, but also a little bit dangerous. Creates some really significant challenges for us as a country and as a people. And I think you can see this transition underway with things like the end of big news of the 300 largest newspapers in the United States. I think about 80 of them have closed in the last 24 months. In Seattle, right? Looks what happened in Seattle. We have Seattle, Detroit, Cleveland, New Orleans without daily newspapers anymore. That has a profound impact on holding power accountable and on communities. We're dealing with it with political parties. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how Barack Obama defeated Hillary Clinton and what the Tea Party is doing in the Republican Party. I think big government, big armies. Here we have Edward Snowden, a contractor on the job less than 3 months, bring the entire national security establishment to its knees with a USB thumb drive, right? Even big fun, music, movies, books, having just written a book, all of the challenges that the digital world is creating for the institutions, the organizations that are part of our culture. Across the board, we've had this tremendous change where all of these big institutions we trust, we depend on, the institutions that really have built the modern America, the modern world that we know, they're really fragile, actually. They're fragile. They're in very weak shape, in part due to the technology, but also in part due to the way they haven't done a good job. I sit in meetings in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, in the executive branch. I go to corporate board meetings. I even sometimes sit in Harvard faculty meetings. And I listen to the people up there describing what's going on and where we're headed. And I think, boy, that doesn't look anything like the world that I experience. I don't think we're going where the people in charge think we're going. And I was looking for a way to describe this. As Don mentioned, I grew up in Asia, and I was a little weak on European history. I had a lot of Asian history, but a little weak on European history. And my wife and I went to see the King's Speech. Have you seen that film? And I got really curious about the monarchy and that kind of transition. And that led me to a book many of you have probably read called The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, right? And I would encourage you, even if it's been a while, to go back and reread the first 5 pages of The Guns of August, where she describes the funeral of King Edward VII. In 1910, King Edward VII, the King of England, died, and they had this incredible funeral for him. She says it was probably the most opulent event in human history. Roughly just shy of 100 nations came to the funeral, all of them with giant entourages and displays of wealth. Of the 100 nations, does anyone want to guess how many democracies? 3, right? It was colonies and monarchies. And then afterwards, after I read The Guns of August, I read a book, King, Kaiser, and Tsar. It's about the new king of England after Edward died, King George, and he and his first cousins, the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany, are writing each other's letters in 1910 and 1911. And they're saying, just imagine in 2014 when our grandchildren are the monarchs of Europe and the colonies. And meanwhile, it's actually over already. It's actually come to an end, right? Especially for the Tsar. And I thought, oh, this is what I feel like. I sit in these meetings and listen, and I think, you guys don't get it. This is over already. If I was giving this talk to you 35 years ago, and I asked you to describe a computer, you would have described something that looks like this, right? A large machine. This is a Cray supercomputer circa 1975. Its base price was $5 million, and it was actually larger than one of your tables. And yes, that's a bench that you sit on. A computer was a thing where you dropped off a very hard problem, and then you came back a day or a week or a month later to see if they'd solved it. Today, we walk around with computers on our person that aren't quite apples to apples, but you could guess this is about 1 million times more powerful than a Cray supercomputer. That's as if I said to you that 35 years from now, your grandchildren will be able to walk into any strip mall anywhere in the world, and for $200 and a low monthly metered fee, buy a Boeing 747. You would think I was a lunatic. But that's exactly what has happened with computing power. That's exactly what has happened with computing power. And in part, that's not entirely an accident. If we think about, does anyone want to guess, what year was the first computer science program at a university? What year was the first computer science department at a university? 1962. And do you want to guess what college, what university? Not MIT. Not Harvard, not Caltech. Very coastal of you. Purdue University, 1962, computer science. Oh, we have a Purdue alum here. And what's happening on college campuses in the 60s? The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. You have a generation of nerds, a generation of computer scientists who go to college in the 60s and 70s to get in front of computers, and they graduate, and who's employing computer scientists in 1969? The Pentagon. IBM doing Pentagon contracts, universities doing Pentagon research contracts. And you have a whole bunch of nerds who really don't want to do that. In 1974, this guy named Ted Nelson published this book, Computer Lib. You can and must understand computers now. And he had this radical call that we have to claim computers away from the institutions and make a crazy thing, the personal computer, to hold power accountable, to stick it to the man. Because if they hold on to computers, they'll drag us into more crazy, pointless wars. Pretty much every major innovator in the digital space read this book. Bill Gates, with his first gazillion dollars, bought the rights to this book and republished it. Steve Jobs, if you read the Walter Isaacson biography, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met about, we don't know exactly when, but between 10 days and 2 weeks after the Kent State shooting. It was one of the first things they talked about. This idea that power enshrined in computers had to be liberated, had to be brought to people, to individuals. And that's how we go from computers that fill a room to computers that sit on every desk to all of these computers connected to each other, sharing things in the office. Some of you may remember the H drive or the laser printer, right? And then finally, we start connecting all the computers to all the other computers in the internet, a quite literal web. And now we walk around with these incredible, powerful devices on our person. It's really an unthinkable and exciting and terrifying state that we've ended up here almost accidentally, without a whole lot of consideration. When I think about the three things that, I could talk to you about Twitter or Facebook or Pinterest, God forbid, or all kinds of things. I could try and explain them to you, but instead I want to try and harp on or identify three things that I think help you understand our technology regardless of what it is. Who knows what's coming down the pike? Twitter is actually not that old. My oldest son is older than Twitter. He's 5. There's plenty of new stuff coming down the pike I cannot anticipate. But I know that our technology overwhelmingly pushes power to the individual. Overwhelmingly. This is about individual personal power, and that's consumer choice, that's political power, that's all kinds of it. It's about individual power and control. 2, it's intimate. Many people, the first thing they do when they wake up is they check their phone. The last thing they do before they go to bed is they check their phone. I see people checking their phone at the urinal. I always wonder, I've gotten incredibly sad news via my email and Facebook feeds about a friend who's died. Or I found out somebody else had a baby and is getting married. Our digital spaces, our digital devices, they are profoundly intimate. And institutions don't do well in that intimate space. This is about individual power. This is about intimate space. It's way more intimate than the living room. And it's also intentional. People tend to come to our technology with direction, with focus. It's not like sitting down to watch TV, what's on. It has a lot more purpose to it. And that's part of what makes it powerful and also part of what makes it dangerous. Individual, intimate, intentional. Now, let's talk about this, how this plays out for a minute. You probably can't read this, but that's okay because neither can I. These are the top 10 highest grossing films in the United States, 1981, 1991, 2001, 2011. The greenish ones, those are original stories, original characters. The gray ones are adaptations of existing books, stories, and the red ones are sequels. In 2011, of the top 10 highest grossing films, we had not a single original story, not a single original character. Yeah, that is disgusting. It's kind of a shock. And so it's no wonder to me, it's not a surprise that people are seeking alternatives, that they're turning to YouTube, they're turning to homemade or amateur video, they're turning to Facebook. People are seeking alternative ways of finding entertainment because we crave we crave new stories, we crave real stories, right? The way our entertainment, the way the organizations of our entertainment are organized, the way they have delivered and shaped our culture, I think have actually failed. And so people get this personal technology where they're going to use it to create alternatives. Of course they are. Of course they are. And so I thought that's big fun, right? But big fun, does big fun really matter that much? Let's talk about universities. This is a picture of Sebastian Thrun. Sebastian Thrun was a tenured professor at Stanford, one of the most popular professors at Stanford. He left his tenured position at Stanford to teach online at something called Udacity. And his quote was, "I'd rather teach 150,000 students than 150. And I thought, and he doesn't have to go to faculty meetings. Brilliant. The cost of a 4-year college education in the United States has skyrocketed. Its economic value has plummeted. The Department of Labor for the last 3 years has this study, and they say that about 19% of parking attendants have a 4-year college degree and the debt that comes with it. The whole system is kind of wildly out of whack. And so I'm not going to defend higher education and rampant student debt. That doesn't make any sense to me. And it does make sense that in that kind of environment, given the fragile nature of it, that we're seeing all kinds of alternative systems pop up. Online education like Udacity, or one called Coursera. Coursera offers an online master's in engineering with Georgia Tech, whole thing online. I think it's running about $8,000. But I'm not too sure I want to drive across a bridge designed by a guy who got his degree online. I think that our institutions of higher learning, for all of the ways they've failed, for all of the ways they've done a bad job, they also are crucial credentialers. They're keepers of the flame. They figure out what is really important. Peer review establishes the safety of a lot of our technology and our drugs. There's some fundamental important values that are wrapped up in higher education, and I want to keep those, and yet the institution itself, the way the whole system works, seems like kind of a bad idea in this day and age. Load kids up with debt, and then, they're stuck paying that off the rest of their lives? We need something to change in this equation. It's not just higher ed, it's jobs and manufacturing. In 1820, the vast majority of the jobs in the United States were subsistence farming jobs, people who ran their own farms, or they were small shopkeepers. 100 years later, by 1920, the pendulum has swung all the way so that the north, I think it was more than 87% of jobs were major corporations employed more than 87% of the people in the United States. So in 100 years, we go from everybody basically being their own boss to everybody having a big boss. And now we're swinging back the other direction. Approximately a third of the U.S. workforce is self-employed. I'm sure everyone in this room knows a consultant, right? Another third of the U.S. workforce is what we call contingently employed. 32 hours a week at Walmart does not mean you're self-employed. You're contingently employed. That means really only a third of the workforce has a traditional 9-to-5 job, and yet all of our social policy, from our health insurance to our retirement to even some of our education, is built upon some assumptions about work that just aren't true. My wife and I talk about our children a lot. Our first son who's now 5, I remember going to the first night of preschool. There was like an orientation night for parents. And we live in this neighborhood that is nice, I guess. And we go to this preschool, and I just look around the room, and I think, oh, geez, I don't think any of these other parents are my people. They all just look a little uptight. But I see a couple there, and they look like they could be our people. We go sit next to them. We get to be great friends. They run a business that would have been impossible a decade ago. It's called Suzy Automatic. They design decals and stickers and cases for laptops and phones, and then they print them on specialized 3D printers, and then they sell them on the internet. And they make a very good living, the two of them, doing this, which sounds fantastic. And like I said, that was a business that would have been impossible 10 years ago. Now, they don't really get any time off. They got to pay their own health insurance. There's no real retirement. The two of them have to be great at everything, from bookkeeping to marketing to logistics to design to you name it, right? But increasingly, that's the reality of the workplace. My firm, my firm just turned 10 years old, the company I started, and I looked at everyone who'd ever worked for me and looked at the people who left voluntarily. And about 2/3 of them left voluntarily to be solo practitioners and are still to this day solo practitioners. So something fundamental about the nature of work is changing, and yet I think our government, our policies, even our corporations, they're totally out of sync with that reality. I mention my boys a lot. They are enormously high energy. They're little boys. They just bounce off the walls. It's like, if I could bottle that, they get up at 5 a.m. and they collapse at 9 p.m. And near our house is this park with these slides. And I love these slides because they're two, 3 stories, and I just run the boys up those slides. And I sit about where this photo is taken from, and I go, oh yeah, go do that again. Go do that again. And 20 or 30 times of doing that, they sleep very well at night. And a hurricane comes through Boston and destroys these slides, destroys them. And the city says, the town says, it's going to be 30 grand to fix them, and we can't do it for 3 years. And so some parent, I don't even know who, starts a PayPal page and prints out flyers and sticks them up around the park and says, if every parent gives $50, we'll have the money overnight. Well, guess what? Boom. In about 2 weeks, they have 40 grand. They give it to the town, and the town builds the slides. There's the new slides. That's my son, Tommy, just desperately clutching his Matchbox cars as he goes down the slide. Now, this sounds like a great story, right? But I kind of digged a little deeper. It turns out the reason why the town said it was going to be 3 years is there's a major sewage problem, and they were going to rip up the whole neighborhood and fix the whole problem and then rebuild the playground. Now, I love the idea that a whole bunch of parents were that engaged that they raised the money for the slides. That feels like a good civic American thing to me. But it also seems like the purpose of the government is to, in fact, set these priorities and to make these kinds of decisions about how this should work, that the sewage is more important than the slides. And I think the story really kind of encapsulates the pace and direction of our technology and the pace and direction of our government. When I was doing the research for this book and tried to understand what was going on, it was like pulling teeth to find out what was going on with the city. It was almost impossible. It was like I got transferred around, I got a voicemail, and then finally someone said, well, if you collect enough signatures, we'll put it on the next agenda. You know, there is this real gap between the process and purpose of government and the individual, intimate, intentional nature of the technology. People have this expectation that they can whip out an app, start a PayPal page, raise the money, solve the problem. And I think that this is actually carries a lot of dangerous notions in it about our independence and about what is justice in America. What kind of responsibility do we carry in our communities? If every community raises money to build their own playgrounds, well, the rich communities are going to have great playgrounds and the poor communities aren't. It's kind of a simple equation in that way. But I also think there's a bigger lesson here, which is about leadership, government, and technology. You have all heard about the colossal initial failure of the healthcare.gov website, right? That they spent millions and hundreds of millions of dollars and the thing just didn't work. That's not just a federal government story. In the last 6 months, I've tracked 5 major IT projects in states, state-level projects that are tens and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars over budget and in months, sometimes years behind schedule. There is this fundamental gap in terms of knowledge and experience among our leadership about technology that expresses itself sometimes starkly in our technology. And then we get to my favorite example, which is politics. You know, in 2007, Hillary Clinton was running for president. She had spent her whole life running for president. She'd worked on every presidential campaign since she was 18. She knew every major donor and every local leader in the country. If you go to Washington, D.C., the Democratic Party headquarters, the building quite literally has her name on it because she and her husband built it. The modern Democratic Party was built by Bill and Hillary Clinton. So how is it that she loses in the primary to a man who's been in public life less than a decade? How did that happen? Well, I think this is, again, a story of the traditional institution. The parties had become really just parties, I like to say cocktail parties for major donors, and no longer grassroots political parties. And technology gave a way of creating a lot of powerful people all of a sudden to build an alternative structure that challenged the establishment. So we have the failure of the party to do what it's supposed to do, and we have the traditional with the traditional party failing to do what it's supposed to do, and we have individuals empowered by technology challenging that. And that's not just a Democratic story, that's also what I think is happening with the Tea Party. In the last 2 Senate cycles, and we're in the middle of this cycle, we've had more than a dozen U.S. Senate candidates lose, establishment U.S. Senate candidates in the Republican Party, lose in their primary to a Tea Party insurgent, most recently last night in Georgia, and at least 3 sitting U.S. senators losing in their own primaries to a Tea Party insurgent, which is unprecedented, really, in American history. And this is part of the dynamic here, is people are powerful with this technology. They can challenge establishment institutions. So in many ways, the question is, what do we do about it? If these traditional institutions that our country, that our world was built on, these institutions that have very hard-won democratic values in them, what do we do when the technology changes the equation so substantially? So I think the first thing we do is that we have to demand technical literacy from our leaders. They need to know more about this technology than they do so that they make better decisions. The flip side of that is we have to fight something I called nerd disease. You may be familiar at the Apple Store with the Genius Bar. That makes me so angry. They are not geniuses. And it's very dangerous for them to think they're geniuses and for us to think they're geniuses, right? There is this mystique in our country about technology that you don't need, that you don't want to, you don't need to, it's too complicated. And I just think that's a profoundly dangerous way to think about it. Pretty much everybody understands how a car works, right? You put gasoline in, there's some kind of like explosion, it moves forward, you put the brakes on and it stops, right? Everybody understands the basic mechanics of that, but most people have no idea what the difference between a waiter and a server is, right? People can't talk about how Google search works, and yet Google search is shaping your worldview every day in ways you don't even understand and realize. There's a profound gap in literacy here. The second thing I think we have to do is we have to rethink our relationship with the people we lead. I don't think of you as an audience. I think of you as the former audience. All of you right now could be on your phones or your tablets or whatever, and you could be going on Amazon and giving my book a one star without having read it. And if you give it 1 star, you will actually kill my book sales. Now, you could also give it 5 stars. Even better, you could go to Village Books and buy it. But you have a lot of power. In my classes, everything I say, I know that a student is Googling to see if I'm full of shit. Every single thing I say, right? Like traditionally, I've been working with a lot of high school administrators, high school principals, because it used to be that to be the high school principal, that was a very prominent position in the community, and now their authority is challenged at every turn. Try talking to your doctor about this, right? People Googling things online and coming in. And now, this is in part a correction to the system, the way the systems have failed, the way the doctors don't explain things because they don't have time to, right? But it's also a real challenge. We have to think about all of the power relationships, expertise, knowledge, et cetera. The dynamic is just different. We have to acknowledge it, right? Rethink power relationships. Acknowledge that the power is distributed, not centralized. The third thing I think we have to do is figure out ways of combining top-down leadership with distributed power. You know, when Obama ran for president in 2008, part of the way he managed to beat Hillary was in what he did with volunteers. Now, every campaign I ever worked on had a fairly traditional org chart. And somewhere at the bottom, you drew a red line, and everything under the red line was a volunteer's job. I remember I had a race I was working on, and I had this volunteer who was fantastic, and I gave her a ton of responsibility. And then 3 days before the election, she didn't come in because her grandkids came to visit. And I was livid. And what the Obama campaign did is they took that red line and they moved it way up the org chart to give volunteers real significant power. But they managed to use technology in part to create integrity in that, to make sure that volunteers did their jobs and were encouraged to do their jobs. It was actually really culture plus technology that created integrity and allowed them to push power to volunteers. And all these volunteers walking around with their mobile phones, they want to do something. They want to be a part of it. That's the good story. When you're able to harness the distributed power of the technology, that's an incredible thing to be able to do. On the flip side, it can go horribly awry. About last spring, I was teaching, and my course schedule, I was done about 1 p.m. And I had a student who was running in the Boston Marathon, and I had given him permission to skip class to run the Boston Marathon because, hey, that was way more interesting than class, frankly. And about 1 p.m., I pulled up on the screen the Boston Marathon website, and I put in his jersey number to see what kind of progress he was making in front of the class. And it looked like he was going to hit the finish line about 3 p.m., which is great. And I went and got my lunch, and I sat down. I went back to my office, and I started to hear that people saying something had happened. And this picture showed up on Twitter. And of course, at first, I just assumed it was a hoax. But gradually it became clear that there was something real that had happened there. And I looked at my watch, and it was 3 o'clock. And I got very nervous about my student Billy, but also his wife and 2 little girls, same age as my boys, who were at the finish line. And I was just very upset, and I don't know why, but I went to his Facebook page, and he had posted one word at 3:11, okay. And I was relieved. And that's kind of like part of the good stuff of social media, that I could right away know he was safe. And in fact, the next 24 hours had all kinds of incredible outpourings. In this moment, people with their powerful devices, they want to do something, right? And so 5,000 Bostonians started a website where they all volunteered their guest bedrooms and their sofas to people who were stranded by the bombing, which is an incredibly generous, beautiful thing. People raised money. Friends of ours knew this guy and his parents badly hurt. They raised $100,000 in like $25 chunks in almost 12 hours. This incredible outpouring for people. And so, of course, when people want to do something with this power, one of the things they want to do is they want to catch the guys who did this. And so the internet started something of a manhunt, right? They started pouring through photos, trying to figure out who did this. And they identified the wrong guys. Not only did they pick the wrong guys, but it ended up getting reported by NBC News. And I actually spoke to the mother of one of the guys who was wrongfully identified. Her son had been missing for a few weeks. It turned out later they discovered he had killed himself. Tragic story. But she's terrified about her son. She hasn't been able to find him. She goes to bed in the suburb of Philadelphia. She wakes up the next morning with quite literally hundreds of voicemails, people on her lawn telling her she's a murderer. It was a terrible trauma, and it was a mistake. The internet made a mistake. But I understand people's desire to want to participate, and they have the tools to do it. The Boston police and the FBI did a fantastic job. One of the things they did is they asked people to go online and send them their photos and videos of the marathon so they could try and use that. But that's kind of where it ended. They didn't give people anything else to do. They gave people no other way of participating. We have almost 15 years now in the private sector, major corporations like Eli Lilly using crowdsourcing to solve hard problems. We need our institutions to do that too, because people are going to do it whether you want them to or not. So better to channel them into process that has integrity. I'll do this one first. Another thing I think we have to do is really demand accountability. There are 7 institutions, the new big. Amazon, eBay, Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft is how Skype is how Microsoft sneaks in, and Twitter. And all of these big institutions, the new, they really control our online life. I like to say that never before in American history has so much public space been privately controlled. And we have to demand greater accountability from them. Demand greater accountability. What do I mean? Well, when this rumor came out on the internet that this guy was one of the suspects, the Boston police went on Twitter to kill it. They said, no, that's not true, which is exactly what they should have done. But I think Twitter actually had a moral and civic responsibility to say, if you want to really have an authoritative source for what's happening with the Boston bombing, you can follow the Boston Police Twitter feed, the Boston Mayor's Twitter feed, and the Boston Globe. You can, instead they let rumor run rampant in terrifying and terrible ways. And we really have to demand accountability from these organizations. And the last thing I want to say is that in the midst of all the craziness, in the midst of all things that are scary about the internet, there is also a beautiful way that it drives us back into our communities. One of the top uses of Facebook is to organize events in the community. In fact, you could say that Facebook's primary purpose is as an event organizing tool, and then post the photos after the event. There's things like meetup.com where people are using the internet to find out their neighbors' names and hang out together and build community. And so it's in the local bonds, it's in the way we can use the technology in our communities to form deeper and closer relationships that I think there is the great hope for where we're headed. And I would just say at the end, that's a perfect segue, it's really up to you. You're all in this room because you care about Bellingham and you are leaders in this community. And what happens, where our technology goes, the world it builds, is really up to you, up to the intention that you bring with it. So thank you very much for your time, and I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Nicco. Yeah. Wait a second. Let me just in terms of basic rules, we have badge-wearing members to ask first, and if one of the mics is working, Joe, is yours working? Hello? This seems very low. Is someone back there who can adjust this?
There it goes.
Okay. So, and remember, your job is to ask a question, a concise question, and Nicco will give the answer.
Not so concise answers. She's saying she's interested to know what I think about net neutrality. So there are 7 big companies that control the public space online, right? Amazon, Apple, eBay, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter. Well, there's about, I think, given how you count it, there's 5 to 7 companies that control the actual physical access to the internet. Almost every American gets their internet access from AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, Time Warner. Those are the 4 biggies, but there's a few others, Sprint, et cetera. Almost every American gets their access, and these big companies have really there's a lot of concern or fear that these big companies will further shape how we get access to the internet. That, for example, what do you have here, Comcast? Comcast could say, oh, New York Times, a lot of people here in Bellingham go to your website. You have to pay Comcast more money if you want your website to show up. Comcast has that power. And so The term net neutrality is about the pipes, the physical lines that carry the internet. Should they be neutral? Are the people who are the companies that own those lines, do they have any power or right to regulate what's carried in those lines? Can they say, oh, we won't carry any Democrats' websites, right? That's like at the root of the net neutrality debate, is are those lines neutral? And I certainly think that they should be neutral, but let me, for the sake of being even-handed, give you a little bit of the other side of the equation. America has the most expensive, slowest internet access in the world. Maybe not in the world. I think we rank 42. Uruguay and Paraguay both have cheaper, faster internet than the United States. In fact, a big chunk of Latin America, Asia, and Europe, cheaper, faster internet access. My cable bill, I have Verizon Fios, and my cable bill is, I think, $140 a month. And we really don't want any of the TV. We only want internet. And they force us to buy the TV to get the internet. It's $140 a month. I was in London renting a flat for 1 month for work, and I got internet speed for $4 a month, something vastly faster, almost 10 times faster than my home internet speed. The reality is that the infrastructure, the pipes, the cables that carry internet access in the United States are actually very old and slow, and we need a fairly substantial upgrade there. And there's really a fight over who's going to pay for that upgrade. The big companies that own those pipes want to keep their profit margins and want to pass the cost of that upgrade to consumers and to the government. The mayor of Lafayette, Louisiana, determined to bring his city into the 21st century, tried to create a municipal, his argument was that high-speed internet is a utility like water and electricity and should be fast and cheap and regulated in part by the local government. And the cable companies took him all the way to the Supreme Court to try and kill it. And so I think that we're kind of stuck here with, at the heart of it, an infrastructure problem. And out of that mushrooms other challenges. So one of the ways that the big companies want to pay for the infrastructure upgrade is to charge more for certain kinds of content on the pipes. How's that for a long answer? Not so concise.
Your crystal ball gazing has been delightful, and I don't mean to crack it, but
go for it.
What about your use of the word power? You forgot the power that drives this whole system. Are you thinking in terms of a world like this? And if so, what about the electric grid?
Yeah.
What about brownouts, blackouts,
Yes.
the use of rare earth materials, and cyber terrorism? The other side of the story,
Yeah.
please.
Absolutely. Well, I am a digital person and a nerd. It's where I come from. It is certainly how I make my living. But the whole reason I wrote my book was a sense that it's not really as fun and as great as it seems, that it's actually complicated, introduces some real challenges here. I certainly think that when it comes to literal power, to gas and oil and the electric grid, I think that the future is very dramatically in distributed systems. The only way that solar and wind really work is in a distributed grid, I interviewed a bunch of CEOs for the book, and one was the CEO of Florida Power and Light, and he talked about how that they have to move from a hub and spoke system, which is the current system where you have a coal power plant or a power plant, and then the spokes, to a distributed web system where every home and every building has some kind of renewable energy and puts power back into the grid. So in many ways, I think the end of big is the only real hope for us in what I think of as the cul-de-sac of climate change, right? That we're going to have really substantial changes to our institutions and infrastructure if we're really going to address the climate change. And I believe the technology offers a bunch of opportunities to facilitate that and make that possible. On the other side of it, there are definitely challenges. I mean, you want to talk, you know how much copper goes into a Prius battery? You know, you're not too far here from the proposed copper mine in Alaska. You know, there is a real challenge there about industrialization and the actual materials required to build things like iPhones. And there are hard choices to make. I dare say there really aren't too many moral ones in that equation. They're both, in some sense, bad options. But I'm ultimately really hopeful about the way the technology facilitates sharing. I look at things like FreeCycle. I look at things like Craigslist. I look at all kinds of apps created for bartering and sharing resources. And I think that it promises a world that's very different in terms of economics from the one we've got now.
You spoke very eloquently about the liberating effect of our current technology. And in particular, I was struck by the going from subsistence farming in 1820 to the mid-20th century, working for corporate institutions, and then a shift back. Given that history and the trend toward the internet technology being liberating for the individual, how do you explain Obamacare, which to my mind seems to be highly centralized, using a one-size-fits-all model, and perhaps based on a mid-20th century industrial idea about how people work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that tying healthcare to employers is broadly a dumb way to do it when really we have the employer situation looks nothing like it did when we started doing health insurance decades ago. And so Obamacare is really a kind of health insurance reform, not really health care reform. And you know, we could debate how great it is for health insurance companies. The root issues facing us as a nation are what kind of health care do we want to have? And what kind of health care do we want to encourage and incentivize in communities? And I don't think that Obamacare comes anywhere near any of that. It's at best a stopgap measure and kicking the can down the field, because it doesn't in any way, shape, or form deal with costs. And the reason the whole system is fragile is about rising costs. It helped make sure a lot of people who don't have health insurance have it, but make sure people who don't have health insurance has it doesn't actually fix some of the root issues about healthcare. I also think, you know, frankly, as a small business owner, it's been somewhat disastrous for me. And I definitely like the idea of making sure more people are insured. You know, that helps the whole society in a lot of ways. It has, especially when I think about some of the challenges I've had with my employees around pre-existing conditions and their fears about leaving the job because of that. I think it's definitely, I would say this, Obamacare is a good thing, but it's really, in the scheme of things, a pretty small thing that doesn't address any of the fundamental issues at stake with the nature of the healthcare system and with the challenges facing us. As long as we see 9-to-5 corporate employment as the bedrock of social policy, I think it's misguided.
In terms of what you're talking about here, and the word big keeps coming up in my mind, and the too big to fail kind of thing. When it comes to security, what do you think the timeline is in terms of the growing insecurity that's coming from this proliferation of technology that gives power to small people? You know, not nations, not big corporations, but individuals who have a crazy idea that want to go do something. How does that impact our security, even here or in the world?
What do you mean with security? Tell me more.
What you've just been talking about makes me feel very insecure. So I'm talking about, what, I don't know if anybody else is feeling that, but this whole idea that this insecurity could become more prevalent and bring down big corporations, bring down big nations, bring down the things that we thought were too big to fail. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I mean, not to be difficult, but I wrote the book because I think we're living in a fragile time. We're living in a time of tremendous change. From 1910 to 1940, everything changed in 30 years, everything. The whole makeup of power in the world, the nature of employment, the role of the military, like the whole thing changed. And women got the right to vote. I mean, there was like lots of things that changed. And I think we're at the beginning of another era of very unsettling change. And what I most want is for us to be intentional about that and guide that and shape that so it doesn't end up someplace terrible. This is like an opportunity for us to say, here is the kind of country I want, here is the kind of world I want, here's the kind of town I want, and then try and make that happen. That's really what I think's going on. In my more radical moments, I'm certain that by the time, we go to see this financial advisor, and he tells us we have to put away at least $1 million apiece for my 2 kids to make sure they go to college. And I said, what are you talking about? By the way, I actually make a lot of money, and I can't do that. It's a kind of madness. And I think to myself, and here I am on the faculty at Harvard, maybe the kids don't need to go to college, right? The Chronicle of Higher Education just put out a report saying that as many as a third of the colleges and universities in the United States might go out of business in the next 15, 20 years. If you have enough people make that calculation, you're in trouble, right? And another radical way I think about it is the state of Massachusetts, where I live, receives $1 of federal assistance across the board, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, military spending, education, everything. $1 federal assistance for every $2 of federal income tax paid. I start to look at that and think, hey, I'm all for Massachusetts secession. What are we really subsidizing here across the country? What are we really doing? And so I actually had to go back and read, Henry Clay's speeches before the Civil War about why the Union is important, because I was really profoundly unconvinced that it was a good idea. And I think that I actually think this kind of thinking about, is this actually the best way to do this, is pervasive around the country, across the political spectrum, across the income spectrum. There's a lot of people who have a sense that what we've got now is not good, is not right. And that, this is America. We deserve something different than what we've got. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to build it? Let's be excited and proactive and civic-minded about that, rather than letting it devolve. And so I know that may not be an answer you like, that it is insecure, but I see that as an opportunity, as a moment for us to own it and to change it.
For the past 20 years or so, I've been creating a model of how to create transparency in corporations, make them much more open to ideas and people's input. I'm curious how you see the internet really helping promote or not transparency in corporations.
Well, this is one of those double-edged swords of technology, right? It has the potential to provide a lot of transparency. It also makes it a lot easier to stay anonymous. I would broadly say, however, that in the digital age, there are no secrets. And it is foolish to think there are any secrets. I routinely have students record class and even meetings with me in my office. without me knowing it, to take notes. Not in any nefarious way. It just helps them with note-taking and learning. Think about how small we get cameras now. The idea that you can keep any secrets is, I think, profoundly dangerous. And so my assumption is that we are headed into a stage of radical transparency, whether we like it or not. And while there is plenty that needs greater transparency, we just came through proxy vote season, which is one of my least favorite things with mutual funds, right? Like, there's no transparency in that. You have no idea what you're voting for. Most people don't even bother voting because it's like ridiculous. You know, you might be voting to give the CEO like a lunatic pay raise when the company's failing, which happened at Home Depot, right? And so I think that our institutions have grown in this space and have somehow lost core accountability and even in many ways lost sight of their core purpose. And the internet is bringing a ton of transparency, but I'm not sure transparency is enough to change that game. In fact, I'm quite certain it is not enough, right? So I guess in summary, I'd say one, in the digital age, there are no secrets. We are increasingly living in an age of radical transparency, and you have to be prepared for that. Transparency is not the same as accountability. You can absolutely like bury things in the most transparent way possible. And finally, that I am sensitive to my own experience that there are some decisions that need to be made behind closed doors. That a necessary condition of leadership and making hard decisions and even having courage is sometimes no transparency. And I will give you an example of this. That I am convinced that one of the reasons, I'm convinced the internet had everything to do with the federal government shutdown last fall. Ted Cruz is elected a US Senator. He has no accountability to the establishment Republican Party. He has no accountability to the traditional media. He has no accountability to institutions of the Senate. He has his own media world online. He has his own fundraising base online. And he really lives apart from everyone else in this institution. And so he is able to bring the institution to a grinding halt without any consequence. And one of the reasons that we couldn't get out of that federal shutdown easily was that any hint of negotiation ended up on social media and killed the negotiations in the deal. That, you know, you take a picture of someone leaving a meeting and you could destroy the meeting. And so when I think about my students at Harvard, one of the things I'm struggling with is how do you be a leader in an age of radical transparency? How do you actually have accountability? How do you make good decisions? How do you do that with radical transparency, with the assumption that everything you say, do, and write ends up in the public domain? I think it's a real challenge. You know, and don't even get me started on the NSA and the way, it's like, we have, this goes back to the earlier question about the fragile nature of things. Now I'm really going to get on my high horse, and I'm just apologizing for this in advance. You know, the NSA is the US government is a very small number of people in the US government, bureaucrats, not even elected, are spying on everybody all the time with no accountability. And when General Clapper, the head of the NSA, behind closed doors in a, you know, in a confidential and high security briefing with the US Senate Intelligence Committee, his boss, the US Senate Intelligence Committee, designed to hold him accountable. And they ask him, Senator Wyden in Oregon, American hero, asks him point blank, I have heard you have this program where you spy on all these Americans. He says, that is absolutely not true. We have no such program. 6 weeks later, Edward Snowden brings to the world all of the memos and PowerPoint presentations about it and proves that General Clapper is lying. Lying to the US Senate about a matter that is, I think, fundamental to our democracy. Does the government have the right to spy on you or not? What is due process? What is due process in that equation? I think there's like a profound moment for the nation here. And I am not happy with any leader we've got. and how they're approaching it. I just think, you know, oh man, talk about burying things in a transparent way. It's like, it's also kind of an interesting story about Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, none of whom are establishment actors. None of whom, like Snowden felt like he couldn't trust the Washington Post or the New York Times. He couldn't trust them. What is that about? That's how compromised some of our leaders are in this equation. And this gets back to a moment not to be too depressing, because I do believe this is a moment of profound opportunity. Like, the reason I teach is that we've got to understand this moment and seize it. We must. That is like an urgent moral imperative.
One more question? Or
Sure.
I think we'll just cut it.